My name is Elena Ruiz, and I've worn the LAPD badge for 14 years. I joined right after college. I was 23, just a girl from Boyle Heights, with a badge too big for her chest and boots that blistered after every shift. Over time, I got tougher, sharper. I knew my precinct. I knew my people. I thought I knew what the job meant, until the first week of June 2025. It started with a briefing before sunrise. The room was quiet, serious. No side chatter, no sarcasm. Just a dry voice from the podium saying, ICE is launching a coordinated operation across multiple zones in Los Angeles. We're supporting with street control, containment, and curfew enforcement. They used that word, containment, like this city was a problem that needed to be boxed in. I sat in the back row, arms crossed, watching young officers scribble in notepads. Most didn't ask questions. Some looked excited. But I felt something different in my chest, a kind of pressure I couldn't shake. My sergeant handed out deployment maps. Westlake, Fashion District, Little Central, all places I knew. Places I'd bought pan dulce after shifts. Places where I shook hands with shop owners and made sure their kids made it home safe. Now I was being told we were going in as backup to immigration enforcement, but not for criminals, not for gang sweeps, for people with records flagged for review. The orders were clear. You are not to interfere with ICE operations. Maintain crowd control. Do not engage with civilians beyond basic dispersal. And just like that, the room emptied into patrol units. That afternoon, I was stationed near the Home Depot off Alvarado, the same one I'd gone to with my dad when we built his back patio. Now it was surrounded by unmarked white vans, agents in plain tactical gear, and a small knot of confused workers in safety vests looking around like they'd stepped into a nightmare. I watched one man, a janitor probably in his 50s, drop his mop bucket and try to show someone a folder full of paperwork. He was cuffed in 10 seconds. No words, no fight, just confusion and fear. A few people started filming. A woman cried out, "He has a green card." We were told to push the crowd back. One officer muttered under his breath, "They shouldn't have been here anyway." I bit my tongue. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I watched the news. The headline read, ICE detains 44 in LA raids. Officials say more to come. The footage showed vans pulling away while neighbors shouted names through closed windows, and the camera froze on one face, a woman in a faded teal shirt standing alone, holding a phone. Her eyes weren't angry. They were devastated. She wasn't a threat. She was someone who had just lost someone, and I realized I'd been trained to see these scenes as operations, but what I saw now were disappearances. The next morning, I woke up early again, checked my uniform, polished my badge, but it felt heavier than usual. Before heading out, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I thought about my mother, how she used to say, "Your job is to protect the people, not the paperwork." And I started to wonder, was I still doing that? By Saturday night, June 7th, Los Angeles was no longer holding its breath. It had started to exhale, loud, furious, and unafraid. Protests surged through Westlake and spilled into downtown. People marched with signs, drums, megaphones, and purpose. You could feel it even before you saw it. This raw resistance in the air, like the city had finally said, enough. I was stationed near 7th and Broadway, just outside the Fashion District. Riot gear strapped to my body, baton on my belt, helmet resting in my hands. I stood in a line of officers staring at a crowd that was growing by the minute. It wasn't chaos, not yet. It was organized, passionate. People were chanting, "We are not criminals. ICE out of LA. Bring them home." A woman stood near the front, maybe mid-30s, sweat on her brow, wearing a neon yellow vest and holding a sign high above her head. It read, Diego Alvarez, husband, father, worker. I don't know why that name stuck with me. Maybe it was her voice. She wasn't screaming like the others. She was chanting, yes, but quieter, steadier, like she was calling out to someone who couldn't hear her anymore. Around 8:15 p.m., the curfew order dropped. Downtown Los Angeles will be under curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. nightly, effective immediately. The megaphones repeated it in English and Spanish. People didn't move. Some stood still, arms linked. Some dropped to their knees. Others sat on the pavement in silence, refusing to go home. Our instructions were clear. Clear the street. Use gas and rubber if necessary. I hesitated as I tightened my helmet. My hands didn't feel like mine anymore. My legs were heavier than usual. An order came through my earpiece. Push forward. And we did. The flashbangs hit first, then the tear gas. People screamed, ran, fell. A young man in a hoodie tried to shield his friend. A woman coughed so hard she collapsed against a newspaper stand. The woman in the vest held her ground as long as she could, then stumbled back with red eyes and shaking hands. I didn't swing my baton. I didn't shove anyone, but I was part of the line that made it happen. Later that night, we regrouped behind a barrier near Hill Street. I removed my helmet and just stared into the night. One officer laughed as he wiped pepper spray from his collar. They'll get tired eventually, he said. I stayed quiet because I wasn't sure we were the ones wearing them down. I think it was the other way around. On the drive back to the station, I passed a wall covered in fresh graffiti. In red spray paint, it said, "You tear gas families. We still sing their names." I remembered the name from earlier, Diego Alvarez. I didn't know who he was, but someone out there was risking arrest just to keep him from being forgotten. And I started to wonder if this job, this line I had sworn to hold, was starting to crack beneath my feet. By Monday morning, June 9th, Los Angeles felt like a war zone. They called it federal support, but it didn't feel like support. It felt like occupation. More than 2,800 troops had arrived overnight, 2,100 National Guard soldiers and 700 Marines. We weren't even briefed in advance, just told to cooperate with command on the ground. That was it. When I arrived at staging near MacArthur Park, the soldiers were already there, lined up in fatigues, rifles at their sides. Some were younger than the rookies in our department. I asked one if he knew what the objective was. He just shook his head and said, "Whatever the brass says." That day, I was assigned to the courthouse barricade near Temple Street. ICE was bringing detainees through the back. A dozen vans, covered windows, no names, no announcements. On the other side of the street, families gathered with signs and paperwork, clutched in plastic folders. Children held drawings. Teens wore bandanas soaked in vinegar. The air already smelled like fear. That same woman from the protest was there, the one with the vest and the sign. She held it above her head again. Diego Alvarez, husband, father, worker. Someone had added a photo this time, a smiling man with his arms around two little girls. One of them held a paper crown on her head. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop looking at that photo. Then the chain link rattled. A group of students had locked themselves to the main courthouse gate. They sat on the ground, chanting in rhythm, "No one is illegal." "Free them all," my earpiece crackled. "Unlawful assembly, clear the area. Deploy CS, move fast." Gas masks came down, batons came up. The crowd surged. People screamed. Someone pushed over a barrier. I saw a woman hit in the back of the head with a plastic shield. She dropped her inhaler. No one helped her pick it up. Tear gas fired. Rubber bullets followed. I tried to hold my ground, but everything blurred. I heard names shouted through the smoke. Jose, Luis, Diego. Then someone grabbed my arm, a teenage girl, barely 16, blood running from her cheek. She held a sign torn in half. They took my dad. Her voice broke. I just wanted to say goodbye. I pulled her behind the barricade and called for a medic. No one answered. The sound of sirens drowned everything. After the scene cleared, I stood alone near a lamppost covered in flyers. Most were missing persons. Some were just names. I sat down on the curb and stared at my gloves, soaked in pepper spray and sweat. I hadn't swung my baton. I hadn't pulled a trigger, but I was still part of the system that brought the smoke. That night, I drove home in silence. I passed protesters with their arms up, cameras rolling, heads held high. I passed windows covered in posters that read, "Your silence is complicity." And I knew they weren't wrong, because I wasn't silent inside. But outside, I hadn't said a thing. It was late Monday night, June 9th, when I started to feel the ground shift under my own boots. I'd just finished a 12-hour shift. Tear gas, street barricades, paperwork no one would read. I was supposed to go home, shower, sleep, and report back at 0600. Instead, I pulled into the department lot and just sat there. Engine running, badge on the dash, helmet in the passenger seat. I felt like a stranger in my own uniform. I pulled up the ICE transfer log on my mobile terminal. Technically off limits, but officers talk, and I'd heard someone say that names were starting to leak through the system if you knew where to look. I searched one name, Diego Alvarez. There he was. Status, in ICE custody. Location, processing, scheduled for transfer. Notes, possible missed check-in in 2023. That was it. A man reduced to 4 lines, a father, a husband, just another case file on a spreadsheet, no criminal record, no warrants, no charges. I stared at the screen until the backlight blurred in my eyes. Then I hit print. I folded the page twice, tucked it in my jacket, and turned off the terminal. Not to investigate, not for protocol, but because someone needed to see this, someone who cared what it meant. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan. I kept thinking about my father. He came here in '89, crossed the border with a cousin and a Bible in his backpack. He worked 25 years on construction crews, paid taxes, never took a sick day, but he never applied for status. He used to say, "One wrong glance and I'm gone." And now here I was, a daughter of immigrants, sworn to protect the city. And I couldn't tell if I was guarding it or helping tear it apart. The next morning, I skipped roll call. I didn't put on my uniform. I didn't bring my radio. I didn't check in. I called in sick. Not because I had the flu. Not because I had a fever, because my spirit was breaking. And I needed to see something that felt human again. I put the printed file in my back pocket and walked down to Grace Unity Chapel. No gun, no vest, just me. I didn't go as an officer. I went as someone who needed to remember why I ever put on the badge in the first place. Grace Unity Chapel looked nothing like the precinct. No fluorescent lights, no clipped voices, no chain of command barking orders. Just long folding tables, handwritten sign-in sheets, and tired hands doing the work no one wanted to admit was necessary. When I walked through the front door that Tuesday morning, no one looked at me twice. I wore jeans, a hoodie. I didn't bring my badge. The woman at the welcome table asked me gently, "Are you looking for someone?" I shook my head. "I just wanted to help." She smiled, handed me a clipboard, and pointed to the wall where names were taped. So many names, some in block letters, some scribbled in crayon, some attached to photos. I recognized one of them immediately. Diego Alvarez. There it was again, the name that had followed me like a shadow. I remembered the woman in the yellow vest, the sign she held, the picture of 2 little girls with their father, a family, the kind of family my father had tried to build when he came here. I stood there, eyes fixed, until I felt someone next to me. It was her, the woman from the protest. She looked exhausted, hair pulled back, circles under her eyes, hands full of legal documents, but her voice was steady. "He's not gone," she said softly to the volunteer. "He has a hearing scheduled. I need to prove he matters." The volunteer nodded, flipping through a stack of intake forms. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folded page. It was the document from the ICE log, Diego's transfer status, proof of where he was and when he was due in court. I didn't say anything. I didn't hand it to her directly. I placed it on the donation table, tucked under a binder labeled Detention Records, Active Cases. Then I turned and walked away. Maybe she'd find it. Maybe she wouldn't. But for the first time in days, I felt like I'd done something that mattered. Not as a cop, as a person. In the corner of the chapel, kids sat on the floor coloring. One little girl was drawing a picture of her dad, stick arms, blue shirt, a heart over his chest. Another girl was writing something on lined paper. I glanced as I passed by. It said, "Tell them my daddy is not a bad man. He makes the best pancakes." I had to step outside because it was too much, too real, too close. I sat on the steps, wiped my eyes, and watched people bring in sandwiches, baby formula, extra phone chargers. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a riot. It was a community trying to survive. And I realized I'd spent years thinking service was about following orders, but maybe it's also about knowing when not to. That night, I didn't go back to the station. I sat on my couch, badge in my hand, wondering what it meant to wear it now, and whether I still could. By the morning of June 11th, the soldiers had started pulling out. The headlines were shifting. The curfew had been lifted. The city was trying to pretend it hadn't been split in two just days earlier. But for those of us who were there, for those who lost someone, and for those who stood behind the line, it wasn't over. Not even close. The press had moved on. The footage faded, but I kept thinking about that little girl's note. "Tell them my daddy is not a bad man. He makes the best pancakes." I kept hearing her voice in my head, over and over. I returned to work the next day, uniform on, hair tied back, gun on my hip. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. At roll call, no one mentioned what had happened. No one said ICE. No one said tear gas. No one said Maria Alvarez or Diego or hearing postponed. We just moved on, back to noise complaints, back to speeding tickets, back to the routine that feels so easy when you don't look too closely. But I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't unhear that mother screaming at the gate. I couldn't unfeel the way that teenager grabbed my arm with blood on her cheek. And I couldn't forget the weight of Diego's name printed on that page, the last thing tethering him to the possibility of staying. The badge on my chest still shines, but it's heavier now. Because I know what it means to wear it while families fall apart, right in front of you. And I know what it means to do nothing. Or worse, follow orders that hurt the people you once swore to protect. I think a lot about my parents, how proud they were when I first became a cop. My mother still has the newspaper clipping on the fridge. First in the family to serve, she called me that week, asked if I was safe. I lied and told her yes. What I didn't say was that I was safe. But a man like my father wouldn't have been. Now, when I put on my uniform, I carry more than handcuffs and protocols. I carry a burden of silence, of complicity, of choice. And I carry one promise I made to myself on the chapel steps. Never again will I mistake silence for duty. Because when you hear a name shouted through tear gas, when you see a child hold up a drawing of their missing parent, you realize that justice isn't in the code. It's in the courage to remember what side you're really on.